All right, welcome back. Today we're on video 5 in my series about professional racket stringing and the responsibilities. And if this is something that you're pursuing or have thought about, or just kind of want to get a good, solid overview of a lot of the components, if you look at the overall outline, you can see that we still have a bunch to go here. This is number 5, and we're going to go over technical skills today. And again, some of these things actually overlap in any one of these, any 1 to 14. You're going to see some overlap, but for the most part, we'll kind of dig into each one a little bit deeper, depending on what it's going to be. So for this one, technical skills, for this part, we'll kind of dive a little deeper there. All right, so let's get into it. So the first thing is kind of understanding racket anatomy. That includes what kind of frames, the string beds, a little bit more about that, handles and grips. Of course, nowadays most the rackets are going to be either some type of a graphite composite, some kind of carbon, a kind of a mixture of each. We're obviously no longer talking about aluminum or ceramic or or metal or wood, obviously, right? So um, and that just kind of it's each manufacturer is going to kind of have its own component or its own makeup of each of the materials, and it's going to, of course, that's going to be kind of some of the selling points of the rackets. So especially when you get certified, you kind of need to know some of the primary companies and their offerings as far as what their racket composition is and so forth. So you can learn that, or you can visit each of the individual racket manufacturers' websites, and you can get a lot of information on the rackets there. But it is good to know, kind of, especially if you're helping a customer trying to figure out, okay, this is what I'm playing with now. I want to switch to another brand. What's that going to mean, and so forth. So it's good to know that. Head size. So we're talking mid. There's not as many mid rackets as there used to be. A lot of them are now mid plus or oversized, and uh, mid could be anywhere from like 88 to maybe 90. Mid plus would be 95 to maybe 100, 102, and then anything above that would be an oversized racket. String patterns, dense versus open, right? So that's of course a big thing when we're talking about an open string pattern. You might have, you know, the difference is maybe a 16 mains and 18 or 19 crosses, or even a 14-16 pattern, or 14-18. There's lots of different patterns, and basically what one thing to keep in mind is when the when the pattern is more dense, meaning that there's going to be more strings, it's going to some degree, reduce the friction in the strings, and you might not be, breaking strings quite as much. And so that's something that you want to think about. So if you have a real open racket pattern, where let's say, you've got 16, 19 in an oversize, um, there's more possibility of the strings moving around, as opposed to if it's like an 18-20 pattern, right, where the strings are a little bit more condensed and they're not going to move around as much, not as much friction, not as many strings, or you're not going to break as many strings. So sometimes you might, be able to, if you kind of know what's available in that's comparable, you can move somebody one or the other directions depending on what they're looking for. Hitting topspin, more control frame, and so there's lots of that. So just understanding not only the materials, understanding how the head size fits into that, and then also how the string patterns fit into that. All those things can kind of work to help you be able to find that perfect racket for your client. And there's lots of variables there within those three areas. As far as the string bed, understanding the main and the cross strings and how they work together, and how the friction is, where the friction is created, and where possible string breakage could be. Understanding how to install those strings as well. The grommets and bumper guards, understanding how to install grommets and bumper guards. That's going to be something important. And, that's something, there's lots of good videos on that as well. As far as like, kind of sometimes it's, what I always like to tell people is when you're replacing the grommets and the bumper guard, make sure that you have the new one with you before you even like try to attempt to take out any grommets or bumper guards off, unless of course you're going to grind one out and repair it. But otherwise, never take it out because you're not going to get it back in. And so if you don't have the right, you want to make sure that sometimes what I'll do is I'll take the grommets and the bumper guard. And even though you think you got the right one, you want to make sure that it is actually the right one and that it looks like it's going to fit. And many times, you can take a heat gun or a hair dryer and, kind of heat it up just a little bit so that you can um, install it and it's a little bit more moldable. So that kind of sometimes helps because when it's brand new, it's like really stiff, so forth. So those are just some little tips on that. Then also understanding handles and grips, understanding the handle core, right? Whether it's like a solid foam core or whether it's something that has pallets that you can take out and build up and or reduce the size. What's the grip size? Generally grip sizes are going to run from 4 1/4 to 4 3/8 to 4 1/2 to 4 5/8, sometimes even 5, depending on, most of the times you're going to have to build it to that. And understanding how that works with the metrics, as far as like what a 2, 3, 4, 5, if the number is like that, depending on, where you're at and where your player is from, because you might have to understand the metrics as well as standard American terminology as far as uh, grip sizes, and also that applies to when you're dealing with strings as well. Understanding the butt cap, understanding how to take the butt cap off, how to reinstall, how to make sure it doesn't move around or cause issues, and doing that the right way so that you don't damage the handle when you're installing a butt cap. As far as like if you're stapling and so forth, all those kind of things you need to do right. And so that's kind of just an overview of that. And the next thing is getting into the strings and the properties of the strings. So, generally understanding the basics of string material, right? Natural gut, synthetic gut, polyester, multi-filament, and then, of course, the hybrid. How you combine those first four into a hybrid string system, meaning you're going to have one type of string on the mains and you're going to have one type of string on the crosses. And there's lots of reasons why you would want to do that. You could create more playability, more durability, create like the best of both strings. Sometimes you do it just with gauges, so you might use actually the same string but different gauges. So there's lots of options with this. And once you start understanding how some strings work well together, not all strings are going to work great with a hybrid kind of setup. Some might be more abrasive and might cut into the string a lot more. So you kind of have to know. So there's just so many things you can do. You could play around with hybrids forever. It's great though. It's kind of an extra selling point when you're working with your clients. String gauge, understanding a thicker gauge versus a thin gauge, durability versus playability, right? So a thicker gauge is going to be, in a standard measure, it's going to be a 15 light. Then it goes to 16. 16 and 17 are probably the most common, but you can get thinner to like an 18 gauge and even a 19. Of course, we're talking about tennis here, so it's going to be a little different if you're talking about racquetball, squash, or badminton. But um, yeah, so the gauge, like if you're talking about millimeter, if you're using the different system, your metric system, you're going to be talking about um, a yeah 17, 18, or I mean like a one. You're gonna, whether it's a 135 or a 130 gauge or 127, 125, starting to get thinner, and then you're going to like, 117 or a 112. And so when you have that option, many times you can actually get a little bit thinner with some of those, because a 17 gauge might be a 125 and then a 120, and then there's a 17 light, which might be a 117. So there's lots of like, you really need to understand both of them, how they work together. Sometimes some manufacturers label them in one way or the other. So you got to really understand that, and kind of what the value of using a thinner string versus a thicker string. You know, generally people breaking a lot of strings, then you're going to probably go with something a little more durable. Usually probably a 15 light or 16 gauge. But then as they get thinner, a lot of times you get more spin and playability. So those are some things that you need to keep in mind. String tension. There's always a recommended tension, right, that each racket has on it. That's just recommended. You can go below or above that. Now, if you do it too extreme and something happens with the racket, most likely it's going to be out of that manufacturer's warranty. I don't really know of anybody who really actually, you know, tries to get a warranty replacement. Most of the time, you just go buy another racket. But yeah, so recommended tension range. That's usually where I start. If you don't have any idea of like where to string that specific racket, start in the middle, and then maybe work your way 2 pounds one way, lower or higher. Um, to adjust for more control or more playability. Low ten, kind of understanding like with rackets, like what's a low tension? How low can you go? I mean, it depends what kind of strings you're using. Some players, polyester will go to some real extreme lows, 25, 30 pounds, or so you can do all of those type of things, but there's things that happen when you string too low, right? The strings are going to move around a lot more. They're not going to maybe go back to um, the original position as quickly. They're not going to play as responsive. And then on the other hand, how high should you go? You're not going to see too much above 70, maybe 72. So, you're usually not going to go much above that. But just to kind of understand how that works with the rackets and the head size and how the tension ranges, because right, a racket strung at 60 pounds that's 95 square inches is going to be a lot tighter than a 105 square inch racket that's strung at 60, right? So that's pretty obvious, but you do need to be aware of that, and effects of how it works with power and control, right? Generally, as you start stringing the racket tighter, there's going to be uh, it's going to create a lot more control for you, because it's not going to be as elastic, and the ball's just not going to project off the strings as much. And then if you're just not getting enough power, then you kind of go down, bring the tension down a little bit. And again, that also depends on what types of strings you're using as well, when you're working with that. So it's a combination of all that. So um, all right, so a little bit on stringing machines. There's basically three types of stringing machines out there, and it's kind of always been that way since electronic has come around, right? So you have your drop weight stringing machine, and that's basically your entry level, where the way that you tension the actual string is there's a weight that's kind of on a rod that sits up. You can see that, and then as you kind of pull it down, and it goes to where the weight is, and then it stops at that exact weight, and then you take the clamp off and on, and um, that's your most basic kind of machine. Then the next is a crank or a lockout stringing machine, and the reason they call it a lockout, because as you are tensioning it and cranking on the lever, once it reaches the tension, a little lever pops up and it stops it from going any further, so the string will stop at that point. That's been the standard for many years, and many. There's still shops that actually use the lockout machines, and they're good. They're good to have as a backup in case your electronics break down, or you don't have electricity, or you're stringing somewhere where it's just not going to be feasible for you to plug in. So it's always good to kind of have that backup. The old Prince, the Prince. Or Ectalon machines used to be the popular ones for that. I've had several in the past, way back, some alpha machines, and I had a gamma um, uh, lockout machine before I bought my uh, Babolat Star 3 and so forth. So, or by Ardo machine. So, yeah, so that kind of brings us to the next machine, the electronic constant pole. Now, those, of course, are going to be the state of the art and kind of the standard these days. You're going to see that every tournament's going to have an electronic machine. Most pro shops, most tennis shops, most once you get to a certain level, you're pretty much going to be stringing it on electronic constant pole. And basically, what that means is it's going to continue to pull the string to try to achieve whatever the tension is, that it's the reference tension that it's set at. And then when you unclamp the string to go clamp your next string, it will continue to pull. So that way you don't lose that a little bit of tension that you normally would on a lockout machine. And if you're at a certain level player, you can usually tell the difference if somebody strings your racket on a lockout versus an electronic constant pull. I mean, I've been stringing on constant pull machines probably since 1990, maybe. So, yeah, it makes a difference. And then also along with those machines, what's the mounting system? What's the clamps like? What kind of tensioning mechanism do you have? And so the mounting system, 2-point versus 6-point, that just really means how many spots on the racket is the machine holding the racket down and connecting with your racket. Of course, if you have 6-point mount, the racket is not going to have the opportunity to maybe flex as much, because rackets do distort when you're stringing them. So that's something to keep in mind. So if you have a 2-point, you can really sometimes see your racket moving a lot more that way. Clamps. Well, most machines are going to have, that have rails, are going to have fixed clamps. Some of the drop weight machines still have floating clamps, and that basically means that when you use a clamp, you're clamping your floating clamp to another string, and that's how it's securing the strings, versus using the rails to secure it from the base, right? And so obviously fixed clamps are much better. So the ones that are on rails. And then tensioning mechanism, you've seen certain ones with the gamma ones where you wrap it around. Other ones, basically, you insert the string and it grabs it. Some are better than others. Some potentially could damage the string if not done right. Some are just more consistent. So that's something that you look into when you're looking at buying a machine. And you're going to find those at different, the crank lockouts and electronic constant pole are going to have different types of systems there. And then the last thing about stringing machines is calibrating your machine, keeping it lubricated, cleaning the clamps, and adjusting the clamps. That's all important, because if the clamps are slipping, your string job's junk, right? It's not even gonna help you. I mean, you got to start over and have start over with a new string. And so, checking the calibration, maybe every 10 rackets or maybe every month or whatever, depending on how much you string. If you're at a tournament, you're basically checking the calibration every morning before you start. And you're just checking it to make sure it's reading what it's supposed to be doing, right? So what it's reading is actually the tension that it's pulling at. And then you can make adjustments as needed. Lubrication, that's mostly pertaining to lubricating the rails, right? So that it's moving smoothly, because you don't obviously want to put lube on the clamps, on the clamping mechanism. You do want to clean it, you want to get some of the wax and stuff off, and usually use a toothbrush or some type of a brush to kind of do that. And then adjusting the clamps to make sure they're working properly and that they're not too loose, not too tight. That's something that you're constantly doing as you're stringing as well, depending on, because if you're stringing at the thick 15 gauge string and then all of a sudden you're going to an 18 gauge, sometimes you might want to make just minor changes on the clamp as you're tensioning and so forth. All right, next, stringing process. Okay, this of course is huge, right? So preparing the racket, that's the first step. You remove the old strings, inspect the frame for damage, you check the grommets and bumper guards to make sure they're not cracked or damaged. And then at that point, you want to share any information there with your clients that you've picked up based on any of that, because that could either mean you're not going to end up stringing the racket and you might end up moving them into a new racket, or they might need to get a backup user backup frame and string that. But yeah, you definitely don't want to just start stringing and end up going, oh yeah, I strung your racket but the frame's cracked. That's not really going to be helpful. All right, mounting the racket, understanding on your machine, whatever you're doing, to properly secure it. Making sure that it's secure on each of the areas, making sure it's not too tight, not too loose, making sure that it's in the middle, right? Sometimes people, don't quite get it right because they're a little off in the center, and then the racket is just over by one string, and you don't know until you have about 3 or 4 strings in, and then you're like, oh wait a minute, something's crooked here. Yeah, so that's kind of a rookie move. But once you really just really take a understand how they fit in there, and just take your time putting it in, you're going to get that right. Stringing techniques, understanding the difference between a two-piece stringing versus a one-piece, understanding which rackets the main start at the top. And so then, adjusting your stringing so that you kind of always go top down. That's just kind of been the standard of how we string rackets. And then understanding how to weave properly, different techniques so that you don't burn the string, or, cause undue friction before you even get the strings installed in the racket. Getting a good over under technique, understanding like if you've got um, uh, even or odd mains, understanding that they're going to be equal on the bottom and the top, or if they're going to be alternating. um, just understanding all the different ways that you can string a racket, um, because sometimes you need to change that based on how you're stringing. So, and then of course, tying knots. Do you use a starting knot, a finishing knot, using pliers for tightening? How do you do that? Or do you use a starting clamp to tighten them? Don't over tighten them. Have clean knots. Don't have long pieces of string sticking out. Cut them properly. Don't cut them too short so that it could potentially create, so that the string might pull out, and get loose. All those types of things you got to, kind of keep in mind. Next thing, customizing and making adjustments. Okay, this is a little bit more advanced, but like, understanding, um, based on the player's preference, lower tensions for power, higher tensions for control, and like adjusting that, meaning going up a little bit, how many pounds you need to go up to really make a difference. Usually I use a 2 pound increment, to really make a difference. Also understanding where your customer has been stringing their rackets. If they're new, if they're coming to you and this is the first time that you strung their rackets, what kind of machine did they used to string on? Because using their, when they're talking about their reference tension that they're used to, it could be completely different on a different type of a machine. So many times they're going to be trying, you're going to want to make sure you let them know that, that hey, you know what, I'm stringing on a computerized machine, so a 60 on my machine might feel a little bit different than a 60 on that one, so maybe we should start with that. Or if you want a little bit more control, you want to have a little bit tighter, then we can maybe adjust and go a little bit higher on that. So just really being able to educate your client on that. Knowing where to add lead tape, for balance adjustment, whether it's 3 and 9 o'clock, to kind of have a little more stability on the racket. If you're trying to weigh it over, create more weight overall, trying to change the swing weight of the racket, putting it on the butt cap or underneath, the grip, or, at the throat, or just wherever. It's just starting to understand what happens when you add weight at different places. Replacing grips and over grips. Okay, understanding grip wrapping techniques. if you have a left-handed player, you're going to wrap it the opposite way, actually, right? So, keep that in mind. Understanding how to quickly put an overgrip on properly, where you overlap it enough where it's not going to come apart, but not making it too heavy by not leaving enough room. So all those kind of things are important, and just practicing with that. And when you're putting on a replacement grip, doing it properly, so like on the bottom it doesn't stick out or it doesn't get loose quickly, and the grip is, whether you need to put extra double-sided tape underneath, or and then of course cleanly wrapping the putting the tape, the wrap at the top, and just making it look really clean. Just understanding all that. All right, problem solving. Kind of understanding, like, when a player comes to you with a racket and the strings have broke many times or just been breaking prematurely. Understanding, is it kind of from an off center hit? Is it that there's a grommet that's wearing, or there's some damage around some corner or whatever? And then then you need to understand, could it have been from the way that they tied the knots, or pulled on the knots? um, Many times, as you get more familiar, you can kind of figure out a lot of times where the breakage, or why the breakage has occurred. Look at how the racket strings are fraying, and maybe that gives you an idea of maybe where the main pattern, where they're hitting the strings. And so how do you address these things? If there's a minor frame crack, what do you do? Do you string the racket? Do you basically look to replace it? That kind of depends. Many times, once you get the racket and it's got a crack, it's probably time to go to a new frame. Um, Replacing worn bumper guards and grommets, possibly grinding out one of the grommets and putting in a new one, or use tubing to um, you know uh, save that string from maybe a sharp corner or edge. Those are all options and things that you need to understand how to do. And what if your clamp is slipping on your machine? What do you do? The first thing I do is I look to see if there's maybe some residue or oil or something like that in the clamp. So I'll clean the clamp really well. Sometimes I'll use a little bit of rubbing alcohol and just kind of clean the clamp itself. I'll wax the rail a little bit. I mean the post, and then I'll use a toothbrush. Generally, you can use some kind of like graphite too, a little bit on there if you wanted to, maybe kind of just so that you're. But generally, just use a toothbrush and just kind of really clean it and make sure, because you don't want it to get oily and you don't want to have any residue from anything on there. So, and then I'll look at maybe adjusting it, tightening it just a little bit, and ensuring consistent tension pull. Of course, clamping the same place every time, stringing the same amount on both sides. Like, you're stringing 3 on one, then go to 3 on the other, or whether it's 2 and 2 or 4 and 4, whatever you do, keep the pattern the same and kind of be consistent in the way that you pull the string each time and so forth. And some more advanced things. Hybrid stringing, again, talked a little bit about this earlier, combining different types of strings. Why do you even use hybrid? Some things are, some of the patterns are going to be more durable, and you get the performance of both types of string. Sometimes you want a little bit more feel, so you want to maybe put a multi-filament in the mains, which is a little bit thinner, and then maybe put something a little more durable, like a synthetic or even a poly in the crosses. There's so many different types of. I might just have to do a video just on the hybrid stringing and kind of breaking that down a little bit. But pre-stretching, there are still. I mean, there are individuals who like to have their strings pre-stretched. You do need to know how to do this the proper way. Usually, natural gut is one that you will most likely um, pre-stretch at tournaments. A lot of times, you will be pre-stretching strings, so you need to have a good solid idea of how foundation of how to do that properly, so you don't damage the string and that you do it consistently. um, and knowing how to string rackets for different types of playing styles, like the players that are more power players or control oriented or sprint spin focused. How do you adjust the stringing or the string for that, right? Power players who are just hitting the crap out of the ball, right? They might be looking for something that's just kind of stiff, just like a poly type string. Control-oriented players might be looking for a combination, or maybe a thinner string, or something that's got some feel to it. Spin focus is going to be, maybe you're going to have more of an open pattern racket. You're going to have a more rougher string, or a combination of a good hybrid to adjust to for that spin focus player. Thinner strings, all those kind of things. Those are some things that you start thinking about. All right, so professional development. Okay, so this is where we talk about certification. When is that necessary, or when is that valued, depending on what your goals are for your stringing. Um, Generally, you're going to look at the USRSA, which is the United States Racket Stringers Association. If you're out of the United States, you're going to be looking at the ERSA, which is the European Racket Stringers Association. I've been members of both. Um, to tell you the truth, the ERSA has much more depth to its professional racket stringing kind of services and programs and classes, and it's going to help you, I think, get a lot further if you want to be a professional stringer, especially on tour stringing at professional tournaments. I think that's going to be a bigger help, but that's for another day. And then there's workshops. There's yearly workshops that they have, and seminars, so you can learn from others and learn how to uh, learn about new strings, learn how to customize frames, learn how to build up grips and put new molds on, all that type of stuff. So, and we're also talking about the business side, right? Building a client base. How do you do that? Networking with local tennis clubs that don't have stringers, um, offering customizable services, and being available 24/7, or having a on-site stringing, having a maybe putting your stuff in a van and just going around and stringing like that, right? So just kind of options, and uh, finding ways to build up your business. Stay current with the industry. What's happening in the industry? What's happening with the manufacturers? What's is there anyone that's when are they coming out with new rackets? What new technologies are out there? Is there any new changes to stringing techniques? For the most part, stringing's been pretty much the same over the last 30, 40 years. There's been a few little developments with, little tools and things that you can use to maybe make the tech, basically to make things a little bit easier. Machine technology has changed a little bit. There's a lot more options out there as far as the computerized machines. Um, but, it is important to kind of understand what the technologies are, which companies are leading in that, and basically who is the leader in the industry. All right, so tools and accessories. What tools do you need? What type of an awl do you use? What do you use the awls for? Whether it's putting them in, keeping the rackets, keeping a string secure, making the hole bigger for the strings when it's a shared hole, or using a grinding awl to cut out a grommet to replace it. You know, understanding a little bit more about awls and needle nose pliers. Why you're using those? Starting clamps, stringing awls, basically to stringing all is going to be basically straightening the strings, very needed. You need to have that. Babble Up makes a good one, and I think you can get some no name, non-branded ones as well. But cutting tools, string cutters, scissors. Having a good quality pair of scissors is better than using your clippers to cut the strings. And how do you cut the strings out? All of those kind of things. Stringing accessories, having some stencil ink in different colors available, and having some different manufacturer's logo templates, so that you can put a logo on the frames for players. If you're stringing at a professional tournament, you definitely need to have that available. Sometimes players will actually bring their own, or they want to logo their own racket, because they will do it a little bit differently depending on what their sponsors are, and then what what yeah, who their sponsors are. Yeah, understanding about string savers and dampeners, where to put them and when to put those on. So those are just some tools and accessories to know how those help your business. So really, it comes down to customer service and communication, um, understanding your client's needs, providing that after service support, following up on them. How's your string doing? Hey, is it time to restring? Oh, you just got a new racket. Let's get that set up and rotate that in, and offering, adjusting, and tuning up their rackets, and making taking the three rackets and kind of making balancing them all the same, and so forth. Just educating your client about strings, when to restring, basic racket care. You're going to find that the customers will stay with you a lot longer when you do that. So, in summary, we have basically all of the things that we just talked about: racket anatomy knowledge, understanding string types and properties, stringing the process, stringing machines, customizing and adjusting, problem solving. Why is a string breaking? What kind of, is there a frame cracked? Then there's some advanced techniques that we talked about, understanding how to use the hybrid stringing, pre-stretching strings, stringing for specific players, getting professional development, pursuing certification, attending workshops, understanding industry trends, tools and accessories, proper use of essential stringing tools and stencils and string savers. Then there's lastly customer service, meeting the client's needs, offering after service support. So, my final thoughts: mastering the technical skills of racket string is essential for delivering top notch service, and it influences the player's performance on the court. As a racket string professional, your expertise is selecting the right strings, applying precise tension, maintaining the overall integrity of the racket. This can make a difference for your client. Continuing learning, having attention to detail, and a commitment to understanding your player's unique needs is crucial in being successful in this field. So, your role goes beyond just stringing. It's about ensuring that every racket you work on enhances the player's game, solidifying your reputation as an expert in this craft. So, if this was helpful, please like, subscribe, share it with anybody that you know that might benefit from this. And again, thanks for watching.